policy and in governments, and that's been really wonderful. And we've had an amazing experience working with Hallie and Maria and everyone at the press, and we're really thankful for this opportunity to have partnered on this book. So thank you. One thing I've noticed is some people engage with the book very deeply, and that's great to see. But something that was, as a relatively new author, I've written textbooks before. This was certainly for both of us, it was our first experience, anything resembling this. It's interesting to see the extent to which a lot of people are comfortable engaging in a kind of superficial way. And I want to clarify that I'm not complaining, I'm not trying to moralize this, I'm not saying kids these days, oh, they can't read anymore. That's not where I'm coming from. But I think it's interesting to think about and talk about, and as scholars, this is very interesting to us, and the role that AI itself is having, I think, in this mode of more superficial engagement we're seeing, and it's something we're looking into and writing about for our follow-up project that is tentatively called AI as Normal Technology. When people post about the book on LinkedIn, I don't know, almost a majority of the time it seems like people's thoughts about the books are maybe AI generated. Or it's someone who maybe spent 10 minutes with the book. And the other related thing is people would much rather, even after having bought the book, hear us speak about the book than actually read the book. And I wasn't prepared for this. As we're readers, for us, and I'm sure for most of you, reading is the primary mode of engaging with knowledge. But this just seems to be a drastic change that the world is undergoing, and there is even a theory we've come to learn, going back to a book many years ago called Literacy and Orality. Is that the title of the book? Orality and Literacy. And people are talking about how there's a reversion civilization-wide to something that's similar to the pre-literate era, going back hundreds of years, not because we've lost the ability to read, but we choose not to, and we choose to engage with knowledge in a primarily oral way and in a more visual way. And we do think AI is playing a part in accelerating that, and it's something we're really interested in thinking about. And I'm curious how you all are interested in thinking about the role of publishers in all of this, and just wanted to flag that as something maybe that would be interesting to talk about. So just a few more thoughts on the book itself. One is the book, as you might know, is in a way mistitled. We're very happy with the title of the book. It really draws people in, and it makes a powerful claim. And I think we try to back that up. And there's so much AI hype out there, and that there's a lot of AI that doesn't work. But we didn't realize the extent to which people would look at the title and expect this to be a book dissing all of AI. And very often they're pleasantly surprised that that's not the case, that it's a pretty balanced book. Sometimes they're unpleasantly surprised because they really wanted a book that would dunk on AI as a whole. But yeah, as you may know, that's not what it is. In particular, when it comes to generative AI, as opposed to predictive AI in policing and hiring and so forth, which we're pretty negative on, we're cautiously optimistic about generative AI. In the long run, we think this will lead to a big betterment of society, although we are very critical of the industry, of the hype, the way in which this technology has been released without a lot of guardrails, with all of those caveats, and acknowledging that it'll take a lot of work to get to a better future. And our book tries to play a small role in thinking about what that work is, but we are, in the long run, cautiously optimistic about generative AI. We don't think it's going away. It's a technology that we use ourselves heavily in our work, of course, not to, to replace our thinking or writing. We don't use AI to write, but we do use it for a lot of other things. One big thing, for instance, is programming. As people who program a lot in our day-to-day or at least week-to-week work, I don't know, I feel comfortable saying it's hard to even imagine going back to a time before AI assistance. Is that a fair thing to say? And one thing when it comes to the impact on jobs that we didn't fully recognize when writing the book is that, will it replace jobs? Will it augment abilities? Those are really important questions, but just as important a question is, when people use generative AI at work, as many people, I think necessarily will, either now or soon, is it making their job more or less fun? That's as big an axis of difference as some of the other questions that have gotten a lot more attention. And there's only very recently research emerging on that, and the impacts are very mixed. They differ a lot by what kind of job we're talking about, and those are things we need to worry about when we think about the impact of AI on jobs. So more broadly, from jobs to capitalism, and I find the capitalism lens to be really interesting, because when we look at the reactions to the book, of course a lot of people liked it, but some people pushed back, some people hated it. Well, I think those reactions are really well predicted by the reader's attitude towards capitalism. So our attitude in writing the book is, it's a necessary evil, so it has all of these distorting effects, and AI can amplify some of those distorting effects while also amplifying some of the benefits, so that gives us a framework for what are the potential negative effects we need to address when it comes to the deployment of AI. So we encountered two kinds of readers who didn't like the book. For one kind of reader, they don't necessarily acknowledge that there are problems with the world as it is when it comes to the unchecked power of companies. So when we talk about AI companies hiring prison labor and refugees and those who don't have a lot of options to work on some of the data that goes into AI because it's really crappy working conditions, and so they are turning to people who don't have a lot of options in the labor market. These are, for us, some of the most serious injustices when it comes to AI that need to be remedied through advocacy and regulation, policy, and so forth. And some economists were like, what is the problem here? Their AI companies are giving people better options than they otherwise had in the labor market. If you're in prison, this might be a step up, but that doesn't mean this is a just situation. If someone had that attitude, they would never be in support of any kind of labor reform if their whole approach to what is just is shaped by what the market makes possible. So that was one kind of pushback that we got. And the other one was from the other side, that we didn't go far enough in rejecting the place of these companies in our world, and more broadly of capitalism in general. And that's true. We didn't do that, and that was deliberate, because that's not where we're coming from. We're not trying to overthrow capitalism or the AI companies. We do think there's a lot of reform needed, but we're not calling for some kind of sweeping change to the world order. Maybe I'll stop there. Those are just some reflections on what we learned from some of the feedback that we got to the book, and then turn it over.
Thank you, Arvind. Yeah, maybe I can touch a little bit on what has changed in the world since we released the book. What are the things that we've learned in the process since about AI and about the world, and where we might have changed our minds even a little bit versus where things remain the same. So I think, as Hallie mentioned at the outset, so much of what we talk about today in the news is about generative AI, whereas one of the main reasons we wrote the book, the reason it's called AI Snake Oil, is because there's so many AI products that just don't work, and we think fundamentally cannot work because of inherent limits to our ability to predict the future. And so in the years since we released the book, we've continued to see that this type of AI, which we called predictive AI in the book, has proliferated, and it has continued to fail in many real-world applications. You've seen it play out in Denmark, where you had a set of algorithms that were used for predicting whether kids would be maltreated. These algorithms were claimed to have a much higher accuracy than they did in the real world. We saw this in Nevada, where we used AI to predict which kids are most at risk of dropping out of school. And this reduced the number of at-risk kids from around 270,000 earlier to basically around 60,000 after the algorithm was placed. Now, so far, this hasn't led to a funding cut, but this is something that people can use to justify funding cuts in the future. But more importantly, I think there's this illusion of objectivity, that the AI system coming up with this list of at-risk kids is somehow an objective way to decide who's at risk. But really, it's actually up to the developer. I mean, the developer chooses the cutoff, the threshold at which someone is or isn't considered at risk. And so this reduction in the number of children who are considered at risk, who will have these greater resources at their disposal, is very much a human decision at the end. And I think predictive AI continues to sort of move the responsibility and the accountability away from the humans who are actually making these decisions by sort of portraying these as fundamentally objective decisions. So that's one area where we sort of continue to see the AI snake oil hypothesis bear out. On generative AI, things have been more interesting simply because the technology has sort of rapidly evolved. And at the same time, the fundamentals, as we see it in the book, continue to remain the same. So one way in which the tech has rapidly evolved is in the cost of these generative AI models. Between the time when we released ChatGPT and today, developing a model or using a model of the same capability has become 100 times cheaper. Now, this might sort of lead you to think that we might not really need that much infrastructure to support AI, but in fact, it's the opposite. As we've reduced the cost of using AI, the amount of things we're using it for has gone up, both across society. So we're using AI more. People are using it for more applications. Perhaps they're using it for harder tasks. Perhaps they're using it more often. But also within the AI models themselves, there's a new trend where models can have these longer outputs for the same query because they take a longer time. They perhaps generate some tokens, often known as the reasoning token, before they generate the outputs. And that means that even though the costs have gone down dramatically, the overall amount of money and the overall amount of infrastructure that we need for powering these AI models continues to go up. This has also allowed new types of applications to be built. So at the time we wrote the book, we speculated that one of the next incoming things, incoming types of products in AI is going to be agents. These are AI systems that might take actions on your behalf. For example, you might use them to make a grocery order or find out something online, or even take actions on your calendar or your mail. These types of agents have now become reality. Many AI companies are now competing to put them on the market. We've seen products from Google, from OpenAI, from Anthropic, all of them competing on this next level. In the book, we talked about these levels of generality. We think agents are the next level on this ladder of generality. And I think with it have also arisen concerns about the environmental impact of AI. Now, that's one thing we did not touch too deeply in the book, but we have been working on it in several follow-up works. And so far, I think there's this interesting mix of local and global impacts when it comes to the impact of AI on the environment. At a global level, the overall percentage of electricity or the overall environmental usage or impact of AI, and in fact, not just AI, but all data centers combined together, still remains relatively small. At a global level, today it's around 2%, though forecasts have it growing pretty quickly, maybe doubling in the next few years. But still, this is a much smaller sort of category of environmental impacts compared to many other industries, let's say agriculture or even banking and education. These types of industries occupy a lot of energy usage, and data centers so far have a small global impact. On the flip side, though, at the local level, I think the situation is entirely different, where the individual communities where data centers are being built are massively negatively impacted by these data centers. So you have concerns around water-starved regions losing access to their reservoirs of water. You have people's electricity bills going up simply because a new data center has a deal with the city that allows them to access electricity at a cheaper rate. You have concerns about pollution and even in some cases, people's underlying health conditions like asthma being aggravated because AI data centers are not yet running, in many cases, on clean energy. They require these gas-powered generators to be able to operate continuously. And so at a local level, I think there are these strong negative impacts that communities are embracing. And perhaps because of that, we sort of hear both of these stories in this extremely polarized pitch, where on the one hand, AI will ruin the environment, it'll cause these massive negative effects globally. On the other hand, people argue that data centers take less than 2% of our total energy use. Both of these things are true simultaneously. And I think the thing that sort of resolves this contradiction is that we have these massive local effects, but not really these massive global effects. And so to regulate these local effects, we think a combination of standards for how AI companies and data center companies more broadly are allowed to participate in these local economies, as well as regulations and laws that prevent the worst impacts of these AI systems, such as relying on, let's say, gas-powered generators to power these AI systems or other data centers. And so these two types of sort of interventions will address many of the local impacts of AI. And at the global level, I think we should continue to monitor these impacts, especially because we are at the stage where we are significantly increasing the infrastructure for operating AI systems. But at least as of right now, the local impacts are much more concerning to us. Okay, so coming to the harms of AI that we've already seen in the last year and perhaps the last few years. In the book, we talked about a number of these issues. And I think in some cases, we found that concerns about the use of AI have been overblown or perhaps exaggerated compared to what we've seen in the real world, whereas in others, we haven't really, as a society, anticipated these errors enough. So in the former category, we've had a lot of concerns about deepfakes influencing election results worldwide. There have been claims, at least for the last few years, that because it is so cheap to produce content that can basically convince people that someone who didn't actually say something, let's say a politician, made a fake statement or so on, that this will have a massive impact on the field of elections and politics. That hasn't really happened. So we looked at all of the deep fakes that accompanied political information in the entirety of 2024 across the world. And we found that, one, the number of deep fakes is actually really small. Across the world, we've only had a few hundred documented cases of deep fakes at best. In contrast, we've had thousands of manipulated images and videos. These are often known as cheap fakes that are sort of made using existing software like Photoshop. In some cases, people depict things that happened a few years ago as if they were happening right now. And because of the sort of hyper-partisan nature of how disinformation spreads, these cheap fakes are actually enough, because the consumers of disinformation are primarily isolated to these hyper-partisan groups. So increasing the supply of deep fakes or disinformation does not actually meaningfully change the demand for it. In other words, we found that deepfakes both have a good reason not to affect political outcomes in the first place because of how concentrated the consumption of disinformation is. And in practice, we found that it hasn't had the impact that many people feared they might. So this is an example where the fears have turned out to be exaggerated compared to what actually ended up happening. On the other hand is the issue of deepfake nudes. So these are sexualized images of people created without their consent, and this has turned out to be a far bigger issue that many people previously might have anticipated. We've had hundreds of thousands of confirmed cases of AI being used to create deepfakes of people, mostly women. And in response, I think we've been slow to react, but at this point we have about 70 or so state legislation bills that have already been passed or are in the process of being passed to specifically target this kind of harm. So I think we continue to need to distinguish between different applications because once again, here the technical advance that enables both of these types of risks is exactly the same. But in one case, the social apparatus surrounding it is such that you need to sort of figure out who the people who are most exposed to disinformation are to actually understand where the demand comes from. But in another, because of the lower standards or the lower barriers to creating deepfake nudes, this now puts this technology within reach for most teenagers. We've seen cases in schools, we've seen cases throughout the world. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the next project that the two of us are working on. Arvind briefly mentioned it. It's called AI as Normal Technology. So this is a project where we sort of pick up where we left off with AI snake oil. Because in the book, we made this sort of bold and ambitious claim that within a few decades, we expect a lot of what constitutes knowledge work today. Anyone who thinks for a living will start using generative AI at some point in the next few decades. In this follow-up project, we are trying to sort of figure out what this process will look like. So what the impact on jobs would be, how AI will be adopted across different institutions, what the bottlenecks for these institutions are. And I think in some sense, the core of this project is to argue that we can and should use our learnings from previous general purpose technologies, things like the internet, to inform how the impact of generative AI might play out and to set policies around them. And if you think about it in some sense, the internet was this massively disrupting technology. 40 years ago, if you told someone that most knowledge work would one day be mediated by the internet, that would have sounded crazy. And yet that's the world we're in today. In another sense, the impacts of the internet have been rather prosaic. They haven't really shown up on the GDP. The world basically looks the same, except in one dimension it has changed radically. And we expect something similar will happen as generative AI is adopted across different industries. So in particular, one of the things that this vision is grounded in is that irrespective of the pace of technical change, societal adoption takes time. And that's because it requires changes to institutions, changes to how humans operate, perhaps even training the workforce from the ground up and efforts at AI literacy. And for that reason, we shouldn't expect imminent transformation of the job market, let's say. Of course, there might be specific sectors that are heavily affected, but broadly speaking, this is an argument against these kinds of forecasts that we often hear from industry leaders who predict double-digit mass unemployment in the next few years. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there and keep the rest of the time for a discussion. Arvind and I had very honestly thought that we would have a much smaller crowd and a much smaller room, so we were very prepared for a back and forth, but I think we can get to it here as well.
Okay, we can take any questions. We also have people on YouTube that may be asking them, hey, Louise. But does anyone want to lead us off?
And could you please identify yourself before you start to ask the questions so people on YouTube know?
Hi, I'm Lori. We've emailed many times about events, which have been fabulous. How do you see AI, and this may be too broad a question, but Louise and I were just at a library conference, and one of the things that librarians were saying to us is, in a university setting, students don't, you talked about reading, students, I think I lost it. Anyway, they don't want to read anymore. They want the quickest, easiest thing. They don't want to write papers, teaching them to write when they can just plug in some ideas and AI will write for them. Beyond the issues of plagiarism in those cases, how do you see AI long-term affecting kind of our education systems?
Thank you. This is, of course, something we've been thinking a lot about, and as an instructor, I experience this every day. Something is changing. I wouldn't. I struggle internally. Is this something that's getting worse and needs to be fixed, or is it just something that's different? And maybe as instructors, we need to adapt to the way that students are thinking and behaving differently. Let me try to make a pitch for why it might be the latter. So there's this very nice metaphor. I forget who it is, either Ted Chiang or Neil Gaiman said AI is like a blurry JPEG of the web. Do folks remember that? So the blurry JPEG of the web idea is that when you're interacting with AI, instead of deeply reading a text, you're kind of getting an averaged version of what a lot of authors have said about a particular topic. You might get something that, is decent. There might not be anything wrong with it, even if there are no AI hallucinations, but it doesn't have the depth and precision that we teach students to lean into when they really struggle with a particular author's text, right? So this is something that people seem to be becoming much more comfortable with. That they're okay with these blurry JPEGs. And I think on the one hand, AI companies are pushing AI as the way of accessing information. On the other hand, on the demand side as well, things are changing. People are becoming more okay with these blurry JPEGs, and I think those two processes are feeding into each other. So when students want to learn something, they approach things in a very different way. Very often they're comfortable getting to this first step of understanding the blurry JPEG, and then maybe they'll decide later if they want to go deeper into something or not. So that's one thing that's changing. Another thing that's changing, perhaps, is that I don't think students have stopped critical thinking, but it's getting a little bit divorced from critical reading. So we've always used critical reading as kind of the only vehicle of critical thinking, but now that's maybe not necessarily the case. It's a lot of other things. Students tell me, for instance, that they really enjoy debates as a vehicle for critical thinking, and debates on YouTube are incredibly popular. And academics have missed the boat on this. So there's a lot of demand for debates as a way of stimulating people's critical thinking on a particular topic. They want to see people with different perspectives really go at it. And since we've missed the boat, that void has been filled by a lot of others with maybe not as high epistemic standards, and this is perhaps one cause of why there's a lot of misinformation in certain circles. So when we look at it that way, maybe students are, it's not that they're becoming lazy and giving up. adapting, I guess, to the new information environment in different ways, and they're doing their critical thinking in different ways, and maybe as instructors we need to adapt. We need to take advantage of these new media as well to redesign how we do education. That's easier said than done, but I do think that's a more optimistic take than students are not learning anymore. Thank you.
We do have some questions from people around the press that were submitted in advance, so I'll ask them one at a time. The first one is, can you speak to the things that AI is best at, or to areas in which it's done good things? The easy response to the idea of AI as snake oil is to avoid it altogether, but I know that's not what you're arguing in the book. What do you think are the most promising applications of the technology?
Yeah, I think maybe I can go into one of the applications that Arvind mentioned during his remarks, which is AI for writing code. And to sort of illustrate why this might be a case study for how we might see different tasks in various jobs shifting even going forward. So in the last couple of years, a lot of the work that programmers do on a day-to-day basis has sort of shifted from like writing the code itself to figuring out the high-level design for the code they're wanting to write, or to figure out what types of applications they're building. And in some sense, I think this effect has been like absolutely positive for the people building this technology, because they're forced to think about the software they're building in much clearer terms. Now, of course, there are these related effects of people sort of vibe coding. There's this term that people have come up with for just trying to see how far AI alone can get you. But most serious programmers have shifted to a mental model where the implementation is done by AI systems, but the design and the thinking of this implementation still requires a lot of human oversight. And I think this is an example of how this shift might occur in other industries as well. Because I think software engineering is one of the first sort of areas where we see this widespread impact for many reasons. One is that it's easy to verify if the outputs of a software program are correct. You can just compile it. Another is people in this industry usually tend to be tech friendly, so they're the earliest adopters. Some of the people building these tools are themselves in the AI industry. And so for all of these reasons, I think this nexus of reasons has led to AI for software engineering becoming one of the earliest applications that has had this massive takeoff. We've seen multiple companies, for example, that have over $100 million in yearly revenue, which is a big thing if you think about most startups not really having too much revenue, especially in the early days of their funding. And so if we sort of move this mental model to other industries, I think this is what we might see for a lot of cognitive tasks. Now, I'm not saying this will happen tomorrow or maybe even next year, but this might be what a lot of working with AI looks like in the next couple of decades. As we start to adopt these AI tools, a lot of what people do in terms of cognitive tasks or jobs then becomes about first specifying the problem clearly enough that an AI system can actually do it, and second, controlling or managing the outputs of these AI systems to make sure that the system is performing as expected. Because as I've started to write code, for example, using AI, a lot of the work that I do has now shifted to verifying that the code worked correctly and figuring out the right mental model for writing this code in the first place, and then delegating various tasks to AI systems. And I think this is what might happen for a lot of cognitive tasks going forward as well.
I want to give maybe one other set of examples. In the book, we recall a funny definition of AI that says, AI is whatever hasn't been done yet. AI is whatever hasn't been done yet refers to the idea that when a technology is new, when it's not working that well, when its societal impacts are double-edged, so a lot of the kinds of things we discuss in the book, we're more likely to call it AI at that stage. But often what happens is it does start working reliably, the kinks get ironed out. Now that's never going to happen in predictive policing, for instance, right? The moral stakes are too high, but there are other cases where a technology started out really crappy and then we just rely on it every day, like transcribing text into our phones, right? So that used to not work very well at all and people love to dunk on it, but now we just rely on it. And we think this can happen in a lot of other cases. I mean, spell check at one point was considered, cutting edge AI. So what are other technologies that might reliably kind of fade into our background? We think self-driving cars are one. So today they're in the news a lot for the wrong reasons. There are accidents that still happen, but I think those are problems that are going to get fixed, and one day the word car will just mean self-driving car, and we'll need another word like manual car to describe what we now call car. And that will have been a good thing, because when we look at the number of car accident deaths, it's really staggering. So I want to extend that spell check analogy a little bit. What does spell check look like for other things? For people filling in forms, for instance. When people are filling in forms for welfare, for instance, so often there are paperwork errors, and then that delays them or disqualifies them, just enormous human consequences. What if you could have AI that are essentially doing spell check for form filling? Hey, you copied your information over wrong, or things like that, right? So those kinds of things are already on the cusp of working pretty well. Like this year, I caught an error on my taxes with AI. And it still requires active effort to take all your stuff, put it into a chatbot, and then see what it says. But these can be integrated into all of the online work that we do and the forms that we fill and so forth. And it can be silently there in the background, acting as a way to catch human error in many cases and making our lives smoother.
There are questions?
I don't know. So we're obviously in this country, living in an administration now that is doing so much, to put it mildly. So, when you kind of look at how the administration and its policies are and are not interfacing with the world of AI, is it what you would expect? Is it catastrophic? Like what? And of course, talk about the challenge of prediction here. But, is there any perspective you have on that world right now?
So if you look at the last chapter of the book, I think we point to one specific reason why we are pretty optimistic about tech policy in general, which is oftentimes what we need for regulating new technologies like AI is not the creation of new laws. Like, we can apply existing laws as well, but to do that requires us to up our enforcement ability. And the way to do that usually has been through the administrative state and through federal agencies that are tasked with going after, for example, the FTC is going after deceptive claims. Perhaps the FDA is going after healthcare devices and so on. And so in that way, we were pretty optimistic about existing laws to serve as the foundation for a lot of AI policy going forward. I think that sort of optimism has not really borne out, at least in this administration, though long term, I think the institution still, if the institution has this role, I think the argument still holds. But at least in this administration, we've seen large cutbacks to agencies' abilities to carry out this type of work. For example, one of the agencies that had been really proactive in going after deceptive AI claims or harm to consumers was CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And their tech team has basically been entirely gutted by the administration, in part because they had many open claims against some of the people who supported the administration. And so that type of thing is like a pushback. The other thing, of course, that has been in the news recently as well is the federal preemption law for state legislation on AI, which sort of argues that for the next 10 years, you can't create any legislation on AI at the state level unless it is specifically for making it easier for people to build AI systems or AI infrastructure. And once again, I mean, I just mentioned that our main line of defense against deepfake nudes so far is state legislation, because we don't really have any federal efforts in the area. And so if we do this, I think we are sort of gutting our ability to take action on some of the most pressing issues. So broadly speaking, I agree. I think in the longer term, we are still optimistic that the sort of foundations of these institutions survive and we come up with sensible policy. But at least in the short term, I think the effects are broadly negative.
So we have a question from a viewer online, and I hope that your taxes resulted in a lower due government balance. Anyway, okay, so this is a question from Jenny, one of our production editors. Many psychologists and evolutionary biologists are saying that our biological evolution is not equipped to cope with the fast pace of AI. This is increasing stress, distorting emotional ties like friendship, love, compassion, empathy that we are endowed with as a human species. Can you address the concern that humans will lose their humanity as a result of AI? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's both a broad and deep question. So it touches on a few things, right? One is AI companionship. A lot of people are turning to these companion bots, sometimes explicitly for mental health support, sometimes for other reasons, but also more broadly, we're kind of assaulted, if you will, by constant news of AI advances and, oh, you're going to get left behind in your work if you don't drop everything and learn to use ChatGPT for everything. So how are we coping with that? So I think maybe those different aspects of that question have different answers. The research on people interacting with these companion chatbots is very, very nascent. I won't claim to have a good understanding yet. There are clearly many dire harms. There was the New York Times article by Cash Hill, was it just earlier this week? It was talking about how there was many instances, but this one particular case that she described was really heartbreaking, where this guy had mental health issues, and ChatGPT encouraged his delusional tendencies, and eventually he ended up committing suicide by cop, as it's called. And there have been many deaths of people with mental health issues in which chatbots seem to have played a very significant role. So on the one hand, while that's happening, there's also research from our colleague here, Rose Gingrich, who's interviewed a lot of people who use these things. I think the average user of these tools knows what they're doing, and they're using it in a relatively healthy and not an unhealthy way, based on her research that I've seen. And they seem to report that it improves, not worsens, their relationships with others and their family and friends and so forth. And also, surprisingly, there's evidence that the assumption that I had and most others had, that people turning to AI companion chatbots is because of the loneliness epidemic, that apparently is not necessarily the case. So this is a much more complex phenomenon than I initially assumed, and a lot of us might assume just based on reading the news. So while I don't know what to say about it, I am glad that people are at least starting to deeply do research on it and understand what the heck is going on when people are actually developing these quasi-social relationships with chatbots. As for the other aspect of the question that I touched upon, all this AI hype, how are we coping with the rapid changes that might happen in society as a result of AI? Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, and this is the main message of AI as normal technology, that even though the capabilities are increasing, our organizations and institutions are not going to change that quickly, and it's okay for us to change at the speed at which we usually adapt to any given technology, which takes a couple of decades. We don't have to drop everything and switch to AI, and there are cases in which workers are being pressured to do so, but that has less to do with the technology than the relationship between labor and capital. I think the solutions to that are things like more worker rights, more unions' ability to push back on mandates coming from above and that sort of thing. We have stories in the book of how things went wrong and how things could be different. So I don't know, maybe I'll stop there. Maybe you have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Hi, I'm Kathy Felgar. I'm Publishing Operations Director here at the Press. And we have an AI working group to study the question of, how AI may help us as a publisher. And we're looking at things like writing alt text, keywords, summaries. But I'm kind of interested if you've thought about AI helping the publishing industry in particular around, marketing, print runs. More titles are published every year, so how do you break through the noise? Questions like that.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are two levels of the question. The first is, what are the specific tasks that might be amenable to AI? And there, I think all of the ones you mentioned are things where we can use AI to at least augment what people are able to do. For example, writing indexes for books, or figuring out what the sort of back copy might look like. In fact, like the two of us have often said that AI for writing is not really at the level that we might have thought. It's not really a good substitute for writing so far, in part because writing is the process of thinking as well for a lot of writers, but in part because the capabilities are just not there yet. But when it comes to rephrasing existing things or sort of trying to figure out how to reframe things for certain audiences, we found AI to be quite helpful. So for example, as a first draft of policy analysis based on some research we do, AI has actually already reduced the time it takes for me to sort of convert my research into compelling ideas and policy briefs. I mean, of course, this doesn't mean that the entire process is automated. Hallucinations are still a problem. There are lots of issues with factuality, so you still do need to spend a fair bit of time resolving all of that. It's not like there's like a 100x or a 10x improvement, but it does have some effects, some marginal effects in reducing the amount of time it takes. So at this individual task level, I think the best way to go about it is with small pilots. Because I think at the end of the day, the people who have the ability to sort of figure out if AI systems are suitable for any given task are the ones who are experts on it. We've had lots of cases where AI experts have tried to make predictions about what will happen to entire occupations. There's this famous case of a Nobel laureate, Jeff Hinton, back in 2016, saying radiologists will be obsolete in 5 years because AI will do better than radiologists. And 6 years after he made this claim, there was a global shortage of radiologists. And so I don't think AI experts are the right people to sort of have this insight, but I do think small pilots can be really helpful in figuring out this type of productivity improvement. The second part to that question, I think, is at the infrastructure level, like what can organizations and institutions do to even set the conditions for adopting AI productively? And there, I think things like leaning into digitization and figuring out how to sort of set up processes that are currently being done manually, turning them into things you can do online, for example, would be a huge boon. For example, in the last year or so, Arvind and I have had to ask Hallie and waste her time, and we feel really guilty asking her for updates on sales numbers. Whereas when we write our newsletter on Substack, this is something you get on automatically, right? Like you have updates based on, I don't know, every time you publish a post, you get like some numbers, you have really interactive dashboards that give you things like that. So even just setting up the infrastructure, which at some point could be helpful in incentivizing or enabling the adoption of AI, would be, I think, something that's helpful regardless of whether or when you decide to do the adoption.
Other questions? I have one, actually. Picking up on a few of your answers, actually, we've all discussed that sort of if you're keyed into the AI news, you just kind of see these very doomsday predictions that AI is going to change the world, and usually not for the better. Within the timeline I usually see is like 2 to 5 years or something like that. And you very, very rarely will you read positions from people that are projecting a much longer rollout or just less impactful. Is that, like, how do people within the academy see how AI is treated in the news? Is the same sort of split in opinion mirrored in the academy, or do more people in the academy view this as very sensationalist?
Yeah, thanks. I think it depends on the field a lot. When I talk to a lot of my computer science colleagues, they're very bought into the hype. And I can understand why. They're kind of at the forefront of developing these AI capabilities, and their evaluation of the capabilities is limited to how well AI does on these benchmarks, right? And in terms of how it does on the benchmarks, it's crushing them, right? It's actually advancing much more rapidly than a lot of people broadly realize, and so they extrapolate from that way too far, and they don't necessarily recognize how big a gap there is between those benchmarks and doing anything useful in the real world. So Sayash was talking about agents being the next wave. I mean, that's true, but we've also written about, we have a big research project, and what are the gaps that remain when it comes to going from agents doing well on benchmarks to doing well in the real world. And so if you have this travel booking agent, for instance, right, every tech company CEO likes to talk about this. If this agent is based on large language models and it has to navigate 24 pages in order to find the right itinerary and book it, and each one of those can fail with a 2% probability because these large language models are fundamentally stochastic and error prone. When it's just ChatGPT, you don't notice 2% of the time it might lie, and we're kind of used to that, and we know how to double check the answer sometimes and deal with it. But if it has to take 20 steps, that 2% at each step really adds up. And every time companies have actually tried releasing one of these products to do stuff for you, like booking an Uber, it has been a disaster. So I didn't know this. I was just telling me when we were sitting here before the talk of how there was this size thing where agents were going to organize a whole fundraiser and charity, and people showed up, and the agents forgot to order food, or they ordered it and went to the wrong address or something like that. So those are the kinds of failures we're seeing, right? So when I talk to my computer science colleagues, they're not seeing those real-world failures because in the lab scenarios in which they evaluate them, those failures don't come up as much. But then when you talk to economists, so our own thinking, even though we're computer scientists, is very closely aligned with the economists. Yes, changes are coming, but it's going to be a couple of decades. And then you talk to humanists, there's a lot more skepticism, and we would really appreciate where the humanists are coming from, but we do think it would be helpful if they engaged more closely with the technology and the reality that this is already reshaping work for a lot of people. Is that fair?
We have another question that came in before the group, before the session started. It's from Jim Willis, our Director of IT. At PUP, we have established an AI working group, which I guess is separate from the production one, to determine how and if and where we should adopt AI tools. So, what is one question you wish our group would ask when we think about AI? This kind of relates to what Kathy asked. Is there something else?
In terms of questions, I suppose the key thing is there are all of these products being sold to different organizations in the name of productivity saving or like making decisions more easy and so on. And I think a lot of the power of shaping how organizations use AI is at the step of procurement. So to figure out what specifically is it that this AI tool or this AI vendor is selling, because it's not always like these general purpose chatbots that can just promise to do anything under the sun. It is often a much more specialized tools, for example, solving a specific pain point. And so I think the two questions are like, what specific claim is this vendor making and how are they substantiating it? Because you'll often find that there's a big gap between the testing conditions for these products, the data that they were tested on, or the benchmarks that they were evaluated on, and how the organization, like the press in this case, runs its own processes. And anytime there's a gap between the evaluation conditions and how it'll be, we shouldn't expect these sort of claims to generalize at all.
Address the other two advanced questions via other questions. So if are there any other ones from our remote folks? Okay.
This is again from Jenny, our production editor. Many are saying that AI is the playing field of the rich countries and that the poorer countries and developing countries are not going to have the means to keep up with the technology. The affordability of learning methods using AI applications is going to impact the ability of these poor countries to educate their children. How do you see AI evolving to increasing inequality instead of inclusivity of use?
Yeah, thank you. So a few answers to this. I think when people think about AI and what it means for a geopolitical competition, if you will, between countries, there's way too much of a focus on who's developing the technology and not nearly enough of a focus on who is doing the hard work of integrating that technology into our existing institutions and, governments, companies, organizations, schools, universities, etc. And there's this great book by Jeffrey Ding. I think it's just called Technology and the Rise of Great Powers or something like that. It's been very influential for us, and we draw from it in our current project, AI as Normal Technology. Oh, yeah, right. And the point he makes, looking at past technological revolutions, is that there have been cases where one country was the innovator, but then other countries can catch up very quickly, but the country that was the original innovator actually is complacent and is not really doing the work of ensuring that the technology is productively deployed where it needs to be deployed. So it doesn't matter so much that a lot of the innovation is happening in the US and China. What's going to matter is who is revamping their curricula so that students can understand this technology better, who is regulating AI appropriately both to ensure more responsible adoption, but also decrease barriers to adoption. In some cases, regulation can actually smooth the path to adoption. So those are the kinds of things we should be paying a lot more attention to. And when we look at that, there's no clear story that it might increase or decrease inequality. It's really a case-by-case basis, and there's a lot of agency that individual countries have to develop their own national policies in a way that's best for them. Let me make one other quick comment when it comes to inequality at the individual level as opposed to at the level of countries. When we look at the impact that the internet had, there were all these utopian predictions. Oh, you know, every kid is going to be able to access the world's knowledge at their fingertips. It's going to wipe out the inequality between high achieving and lower achieving students. And that is certainly true for some students, but what we've also seen is social media and addiction and so forth. So these are factors that have exacerbated inequality, because in wealthy and privileged families, you know, parents are much more able to shape and control how their children interact with technology in positive as opposed to addicting ways. But you know, if someone's working 3 jobs and they don't necessarily have that time to put into how their children are interacting with technology, it's much more likely to be negative. And we worry a lot that AI could be very similar, and we talk about that in the final chapter of the book, how AI-enabled addiction could potentially be far worse than what we've seen with social media. So I don't think we as in policymakers, for instance, or civil society groups, and certainly companies are showing the foresight to anticipate those problems before they come up. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have a wave similar to social media where AI does have these negative effects on some section of children, and then we're going to wake up to that and start figuring out what to do about it.
Great. Oh, Tim?
I want to circle back to a variation on the question that Lori asked. When you're interacting with your students, you know, some people are using this to do work for them, and some people are figuring out ways to maintain critical thinking ability. And have you figured out how to foster the latter?
Yeah, we're trying. I won't claim to have all the answers.
Ourselves, how to build that into our critical thinking.
Yeah, that's right. So let me share some of my experiences as a learner and then some of my experiences as an instructor. I'm curious what your experiences have been as well. So when ChatGPT came out, I thought one of the things I would definitely not use it for is learning new things, because I'd never know. Especially if it's a topic I'm not already an expert on, when it's giving me wrong information. But as I started experimenting with it, what I realized is that knowing that 1 out of 10 things it's telling me is going to be wrong puts me in a very critical frame of mind. It's actually very conducive to learning. So I've actually made that part of my habit now, and it's become, not just ChatGPT, but various kinds of AI tools have become an integral part of how I learn new things. Of course, I haven't stopped reading books. But I can't ask a question to a book, and I can't summarize my knowledge of a topic to a book and ask it if I've gotten it right or wrong. These are things I can do with AI. So I've been really trying to incorporate it, and I like to think it's been very helpful. But it does take, it's not a one-time thing to learn how to use it. It requires constant vigilance to ensure that I'm not using it as a crutch, that I'm maintaining my critical thinking through this process. So turning to my students, I think they are very aware that it could have, very double-edged effects. And to the extent they're using it, they want to make sure they're using it in a way that helps them. Some students, of course, want to coast through their classes, and it is what it is. There's not a whole lot I can do about that. But for the 80–90% of students, right, who are coming in with the right frame of mind, I think one thing that I do is I've changed the nature of the work that I give them. Sometimes, I have to teach them and test them on basic stuff, but a lot of the time I can go beyond that, even in undergrad classes, and emphasize things that are close to the boundary of knowledge, where they can use AI tools, but if they purely delegated the work to AI tools, they're going to get a B or a C grade, because it's really bad at going beyond what's in its training set and coming up with really new insights to tackle the task that I'm asking them to do. So that forces them to both use AI, because I'm asking them to do more things and harder things, but also to go beyond what the AI tool can give them and to ensure that they're not using it as a crutch. So it's been a positive experience so far. I don't have any peer-reviewed studies on how well it's working, but in terms of the vibes, if you will, it seems to be going well.
Maybe one more data point to that is there are all of these large-scale institutional experiments that are happening right now that I think are easy to criticize, but I think we can learn a lot from. So the two that come to mind are there's this online learning service, this tutoring service called Math Academy, which is sort of trying to come up with what individualized one-on-one tutoring looks like when you do have an active tutor in the form of AI. And early evidence from their studies, and once again with a grain of salt because this is evidence coming from them, this is not peer-reviewed, is you can dramatically speed up the extent to which people learn different concepts. Because unlike in school where you're sort of forced to stick to a standard, and this is a vision we've been promised many times, like for the last 2 decades you've had AI experts or companies or whatever telling you that we can have this vision of one-to-one tutoring. But I think because of the advances that we've seen in the last decade or so, or at least the last 2-3 years, I think this is becoming closer. So I think this is one place where I'm paying attention to figure out what the trend would look like, perhaps as a model for how we might do it in other places. Of course, math is different because you have verifiable answers. You can sort of figure out if a student gets it or not. There are many ways in which it can be gamified more easily than other disciplines. But I think it'll be like a leading trend for what we might expect, or at least like one data point for what we might expect institutionally learning to look like in the next 5 years. The other is this more ambitious experiment, which is called Alpha School, which sort of tries to get rid of the concept of teachers altogether. Now, again, I'm more skeptical of this than Math Academy because the latter is focused on a much narrower problem. But this is sort of trying to come up with the idea of what school would look like if we sort of gave up on existing institutions and tried to coach children from the ground up in their use of AI. And of course, you have certain guardrails. You have guardians who are looking after kids as they're learning. You have standardized tests on the way to sort of help gauge how quickly kids are learning and so on. But the majority of the teaching is actually done in correspondence with an AI system. So once again, very skeptical so far. We should sort of take anything they say with a grain of salt. But these are 2 institutional experiments that are currently going on that I'm excited about and excited about seeing where they end up.
Any last burning questions? Great. Well, thank you guys so much. This was wonderful. Yeah, thank you.